Basically, I started writing back in 1996. I've been writing my whole life. But I met somebody who, we were in Italy together at the same time working on a project, and it was a really awful Machiavellian environment in Italy, if you can imagine that. And all of these terrible political games being played, and we were just miserable and depressed. It was actually 95. And he was a book packager, and he asked me if I had any ideas for books. And all of this pain that I had been through in the work world with all of these political conniving figures, it just came up out of me, and it was a beautiful day in Venice, Italy, and I sort of improvised this idea for a book, and he loved it, and he basically paid me to live while I wrote the 48 Laws of Power, and that's where it started. So for 15, 16 years, I've had this sort of weird position in life that I don't know how many other people have had, where I've been able to devote all of my attention to studying what I consider to be the most kind of powerful, charismatic, successful Machiavellian characters in history and contemporary figures like 50. So I may not be good at many things. I can't build things with my hands or anything like that, but I have this one expertise. Why some people excel, why some people are superior in the political game or in their creativity or whatever it is. And so in figuring out what I wanted to talk to you about today, and I was talking with Casper, who I want to thank for helping to organize this, there's a sort of a philosophy that all of these figures that I've studied, that they all share. And, I'm often asked, people say, well, I want to become powerful. What's the secret to it? And I don't believe in that kind of glib 4-sentence or one-book answer about how to be powerful. But there is an attitude towards life, a way of looking at things, a way of thinking, that all of these people that I've been studying, they all share this kind of way of looking at the world. It's what I call radical realism. And the reason I call it radical is realism has this sort of idea of just sort of understanding the world, and it sort of has a cynical, sometimes an edge to it. And I want the idea of really deeply understanding what life is about, how people operate in this world, and not only being realistic and understanding it, but accepting in a very deep way that this is what the world is like, and actually loving it and embracing it and working with reality. And all of these figures, from 50 Cent to Napoleon Bonaparte to Cleopatra to John F. Kennedy, I believe they all share this kind of attitude. So I'm going to talk, hopefully not too long, because I really want to get to your questions, and I encourage you to barrage me with all kinds of difficult questions. I want to talk about 3 aspects of this attitude. The first is what I call Machiavellian realism, or the Machiavellian reality. The second is existential reality, what it really means to be a human being. And the third is what I call aesthetic realism. And my idea is that to the degree that you accept these realities in life, you're going to be successful and powerful. And to the degree that you deny them and you avoid them and you hate them and you're miserable about them and you try and run away, you're not going to have success in life. And so the first one, as I said, is what I call our Machiavellian reality. And there's a concept that's lately kind of fascinates me that I've been using for my next book. And it's a term called Machiavellian intelligence. And it's something that came about in the 60s and 70s, where various scientists, people studying the brain, they're trying to understand why is it that the human brain is so much larger than anything else we have in nature. How did this happen? Why did our brains develop in this way so rapidly and become so much more complex than any other animal on the planet? And they basically went back to primates. Unless you believe in creationism, our ancestors. And basically, primates are the other animal that have this exceptionally large brain, a brain that seems to be in excess of their needs. And to explain why our brains developed in this way, they looked at primates, and they came up with a really fascinating theory called Machiavellian intelligence. And the gist of it is the following. What makes primates different from any other animal is that they live in very complex social environments. There are other animals like wolves, etc., that live in packs, that have hierarchies, the alpha male, etc. But primates, if I'm talking about chimps, baboons, orangutans, that whole group, have a much deeper, a much more complex social organization. They have rituals of grooming, where they groom each other for hours upon hours during the day, forming all kinds of friendships and alliances. They remember these friendships and these alliances over the space of 10, 20 years. The other thing that primates have that's so bizarre and interesting is that they're the only animal we know that practice deception, games of manipulation among each other. There is no other animal on the planet that we can say that about. And so they label primates as the Machiavellian creature, the Machiavellian animal. And they've shown colonies of monkeys, for instance, in Puerto Rico, where they do a lot of studies, incredible games of manipulation that are going on among these little small communities. And one of the discoveries that they have in looking at these primates is that they possess a power that is known as the theory of mind. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with this concept, but basically it's the idea that only humans or primates have a concept where I can think about perhaps what is going on in your mind right now. Most animals can only judge another creature based on its outward behavior, about what they're doing, about the threat that they perhaps represent. But a human and a primate has the capacity to actually literally imagine what is it that I'm pointing to you, because I'm thinking about you right there. What is it exactly that is going on in your brain right now? What are you thinking? What are you thinking right now? Now, they've discovered that primates actually possess this theory of mind. It's related to something called mirror neurons. I'm not going to get too technical with you here. I'm not a neuroscientist myself. But basically, mirror neurons is this fascinating phenomenon where if I pick up my cell phone, they can look on a map of my brain and see that certain neurons are firing when I actually pick up this phone. If I watch him pick up the phone, the same neurons are firing. It's called mirror neurons. And so basically, this allows me to learn by imitation. I can experience what you're doing with picking up that phone as if I almost myself were feeling that. This allows humans and primates to understand and to put themselves in the mind of another person. This allows for all kinds of complicated social behavior. It allows for us to be empathetic creatures, to cooperate, but it also allows for very deep levels of deception, manipulation, con games, whatever you want to call it. Because the moment I know what you're thinking, or I can imagine what your intentions are, I can strategize, I can play all kinds of games, I can try and distract you, deceive you, etc. They've shown that monkeys, for instance, possess these mirror neurons, that chimpanzees possess this ability of theory of mind, and from all of this stems all of this incredible Machiavellian behavior. And so the theory, to bring this all back to it, of Machiavellian intelligence is that the reason primate brains develop so rapidly is in dealing with this very complicated social environment. An animal normally is only dealing with its physical environment, but primates are dealing with their social environment, and it's in dealing with the social problems, in dealing with fellow chimpanzees and what they are thinking, that the brain had to develop very rapidly in a very small period of time. Primates started evolving, modern primates as we know them, 40 million years ago. Some 6 million years ago, we humans diverged from that, and we had the first, what is known as Homo erectus. And our earliest ancestors have this inheritance in them, this Machiavellian intelligence. And we formed larger and larger groupings. We were the first animal that actually hunted big game, and in creating, being able to hunt something like that involved all kinds of complicated organization. So if you map out very rapidly, and I'm skipping over millions of years of history, and somebody would, a historian would be very offended by how I'm doing this, but you would see an incredible increase in this social complexity over millions of years, leading up to a modern era where a person who is raised as a human being in our environment is not simply dealing with a group of 20 people and having to figure out how to navigate in that world, but you're talking about people, us, who have to deal with thousands upon thousands of people living in communities, in our workplace, in politics, in government, in business. All of the deep levels of manipulation, deception, cooperation, that whole element that goes into what is known as Machiavellian intelligence. And so through this concept, the idea is that we humans, the reason why we've evolved so rapidly, why we are so clever, why we are so smart, is that we are inherently social creatures. That you can't divorce the games that we have to play, what we have to learn in how to get along with other people. You can't divorce that from our other forms of intelligence. This is very much who we are. We are, by our nature, the Machiavellian animal. It is 40 million years of evolution, starting from primates back then to who we are now. There's no way to deny that. There's no way to, in the course of 20 years or 80 years, to evolve beyond it. It's who we are. And so this is my definition of that first sort of basic reality, what I call our social reality, or the Machiavellian reality. Now, there's nobody out there who really talks about this. There are not many books written about it. There's nobody here at Yale teaching a class on how to be Machiavellian in the world, or how to handle that kind of environment, at least as far as I know. When you enter the real world, you're suddenly blindsided by this whole realm that exists. It's like our dirty little secret. People will talk about their sex lives. You'll get Dr. Ruth here. We'll go through all of that. But nobody talks about all of these power games that are constantly going on in the world. So I just wanted to interject into this idea my own personal story when I got out of college and I suddenly was confronted with this real world. I had graduated, as he mentioned, in a classical background, and I was immersed in studying philosophy and literature and languages. And so when I started working essentially in magazines, I worked at Esquire magazine and a few others, I had no idea of how the things operated in the real world, and I was very much shocked by all of the egos and the insecurities and the game playing and the political stuff. It really kind of disturbed me and it upset me. And I can remember when I was about 26 or 27 years old, one particular job that was kind of the turning point in my life. I'm not going to tell you which job this was. I don't want you Googling it and figuring out who I'm talking about. But basically the job was I had to find stories that would then be put into either film or a magazine, whatever. But I was judged on how many good stories I found. And so in this job, I actually I thought I'm a very competitive person, And I was doing better than anybody else there. I was finding more stories that ended up getting produced because I felt that's the point. You're trying to produce. You're trying to get work done. Isn't that the most important thing? Isn't that why we're all here? And suddenly I found that my superior, this woman, whose name I won't mention, made it very clear that she wasn't happy with me, that something was wrong. I was doing something wrong, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And so going on what I was mentioning, that theory of mind, that power that we have, I sort of put myself in her shoes, and I'm thinking, what is it that I'm doing that's displeasing her? I'm clearly producing. And I figured out, well, maybe it's because I'm not involving her in what I'm in my ideas. I need to run them by her. I need to make it, involve her more so she feels like she's a part of the research that I'm doing. So I would go into her office and I would tell her where my ideas were coming. I was trying to engage with her, figuring that was the problem. Well, that didn't seem to work. She was still clearly unhappy with me, maybe didn't like me. So I thought, going further, well, maybe I'm not being friendly enough with her. Maybe I need to be nice to her. Maybe I need to go in and not talk about work, but just be nice and talk like a human being. Okay, so that was strategy number 2. I started doing that. Still didn't have any effect. She still seemed really cold and kind of mean. I figured, all right, she just hates me. That's just life. Not everybody can love you. That's just it. I mean, what the hell? I'll just do my job. And one day we're having a meeting in which we're discussing our ideas, and she suddenly erupts. She says, "Robert, you have an attitude problem." I go, "What? You're not listening to people here." "I'm listening, but I mean, I produce, I do my work. What, you're going to judge me about how wide my eyes are open and how I'm listening to people? No, you have a problem here." "I'm sorry, I don't think I do." Anyway, over the course of the next few weeks, she just started kind of torturing me about this idea that I had an attitude. And of course, naturally, I developed an attitude. I started resenting her, and a couple weeks later, I quit because I hated it. I probably quit a week before they were going to fire me anyway. And I went home, and over the course of several weeks, I thought really deeply about this. What happened here? What did I do wrong? I mean, she just didn't like me. I think I'm a likable person. And I came to this conclusion. I had violated a law of power 12 years before I ever wrote the book. Law number 1, never outshine the master. I had gone into this environment thinking that what mattered was doing a great job and showing how talented I was. But in doing that, I had made this woman, my superior, insecure that maybe I was after her job, or that maybe I was better than she was, and I would make her look bad because the great ideas were coming from me, not from her. And I had violated law number 1, and when you violate law number 1, you're going to suffer for it, because you're touching on a person's ego and their insecurity, and that's the worst thing you can do. And that's what had happened. So in reflecting over this, it was kind of the turning point in my life, and I said, I'm never going to let this happen again. I'm never going to get emotional, because that's what happened. I basically reacted emotionally to her torturing me and developed an attitude. I'm never going to let that happen again. I don't care. I'm a writer. I don't care about these jobs that I get. I'm just going to become a master observer of the game of power. I'm going to watch these people as if they were mice in a laboratory. With some distance. And I developed a motto that I still use to this day, and that motto is, it's all material. Everything that happens is material. Material for a book, material for a novel, for a screenplay. I want to be the master observer of this world. And this suddenly allowed me now to not only observe the power games going on in the many different kinds of jobs that I've had, and I can tell you I've had jobs from working in journalism, I worked in a detective agency, I worked for music producer, I worked for film, everything possible. In having this distance and looking at the world like this, suddenly I had power. I wasn't emotionally involved, I had some distance, and I could deal with things. And from that, I developed the 48 Laws of Power when I was finally given the opportunity to write the book. And so what I decided in the 48 Laws, and has since is very much a part of me, is that if this is the reality that we must all deal with, that we are social creatures, that we live in environments where there are all kinds of complicated networks, we are in a way defined by how we handle this reality. And there are three types of people in this world in dealing with this social reality. There are what I call the deniers, the people who deny this reality exists. They almost want to pretend that we're descended from angels and not from primates. That what I'm talking about here is cynical, it doesn't really exist, it doesn't happen. Among these deniers, you'll find two types. You'll find people who are genuinely disturbed by the politicking aspect of human nature, and they don't want any kind of job in which they have to do that. And so you'll find that they're slowly marginalized, and they can be happy that way, and they're never going to assume a position of great responsibility because it involves all of this. The other branch of the deniers are the people that are like the passive aggressors. I would classify this woman who had tortured me as a kind of a classic passive aggressor. People who consciously don't want to admit that there's any kind of manipulation going involved, but unconsciously are playing all kinds of games. And in my books, I often describe the many different kinds. They're the trickiest kind of person to deal with, the passive aggressors. The second type of person, besides the deniers, are those who love this Machiavellian part of our nature and revel in it, and are master manipulators and con artists and connivers, and are very aggressive, and they have no problem handling this part. In fact, they love it. This type of person, which is very, usually you'll find one or two in an office or an environment, they can get pretty far, but eventually they're tripped up in life because they're too Machiavellian. They don't understand that there's the other side to that whole idea of theory of mind and the mirror neurons, which is empathy and cooperation and getting other people and seducing people and getting them to work with you. They're too much involved with themselves and their own ego, and they love manipulating until they go too far and they have a fall in life, and there's like a wall, they can never get past it. The third type is what I'm calling the radical realist. It's what I'm proposing that you adopt. And it goes as follows. This is our nature. This is how we evolved over millions of years. There's no point in denying it. It's who we are. And not only am I not going to deny it, I'm going to accept that this is the human being as it has evolved over all of this time. And in fact, I love it. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with the fact that in this world people are playing political games. There's nothing wrong with the fact that there are seducers and con artists and it's going on all the time. It's just reality. It's just the world as it is. Stop fighting it. Just accept it. Within that accepting of it, it's not that you love it and want to go out in the world and play all these nasty games. It's that you understand they exist. If occasionally you have to do them, fine. That's okay, within reason. If it's often other people are practicing against you, which you'll find a lot in your life once you leave the confines of Yale, that's okay. You understand the laws of power. You understand what people are up to, and they can't necessarily hurt you. In accepting this reality and in dealing with it and in studying human nature and this aspect of what I call Machiavellian intelligence, suddenly, with that attitude, with that mentality, you have all kinds of power and freedom. Ever since I wrote my books and they've been published, I do all kinds of consulting work with business leaders, political figures, artists, very powerful people. Most of them are absolutely brilliant. They're brilliant at the technical side of their business. They figured out how to make a lot of money. They figured out how to maybe win elections or how to create a kind of music, etc., and market it. But they inevitably come to me for advice because they have a blind spot. They don't understand the human nature, the political games that are going on. They don't understand why somebody who they groomed as a successor, who they brought off the streets and helped and gave money to and developed, is suddenly turning against them and betraying them in a very overt manner. It's because they've spent their whole lives studying the technical side of their field, and they haven't spent any time observing other people. They haven't spent any time understanding human nature and why some people have egos and how that kind of ego will operate in an environment like an office. And this is the part of the game that trips up most people. And all I'm trying to say is that in accepting it and in studying it and opening your eyes to this reality, you're going to suddenly find yourself that there's a whole other realm of life that you're not observing, that you're not paying attention to. And if you pay attention to it, suddenly the whole power game, the whole dynamic will alter in your favor. The second reality I want to talk about is in context of my work with 50 Cent. A few years ago, I was contacted by 50, Curtis Jackson, and out of the blue, he was a big fan of the 48 Laws of Power. And I had known that, there was something going on in the hip-hop world, like Jay-Z had been quoting the book, and Nas had quoted one of the songs and lyrics. So something was happening. But 50 wanted to meet me. I had no idea, but I was excited by that. So we met, and we kind of hit it off in a very weird way. You can't imagine two people from two more different backgrounds in the world than he and I. But there was something about us that really clicked. So we decided, based on this, to do a book together. And I decided, after meeting him and spending some time with him, that this guy is really different. Now, I live in Los Angeles. I'm not somebody who's generally starstruck. I'm not interested in celebrities. They bore me. They don't interest me. So it wasn't a celebrity thing. There was something about him that was really interesting. He was really different. He had a kind of calmness. He had a charisma. He had power. So I wanted to figure out what made him different. Why is he like this? So maybe we could learn something from him, and I would express that in the book. So we would spend a long time talking about his life. And in talking about his life, I sort of began to see a pattern. So I don't know how familiar you are with this, but at the age of about 9 years old, he started hustling on the streets in Southside Queens, dealing drugs. He did that because he realized that school was a complete dead end for somebody from his background, that only suckers went into school. The schools were really bad. They led to really bad jobs. The only people he could see in the hood that had power were the hustlers, so he was going to become a great hustler. And 9 years old is kind of early to start hustling, but that's when he would do it. So he was sitting there hustling on the streets. And soon he discovered that hustling wasn't what he thought it was. It was actually quite boring. Day after day at 6 o'clock in the morning, you had to stand on the street corner. Nothing would happen. You just had to think about whatever. You had no books, nothing to read, no music, nothing to listen to. Just waiting for people to buy your drugs. It was so boring, and it wasn't glamorous at all. And on top of that, it was a trap. Hustlers don't get out of their life. Most of them die by the time. Very few of them live past the age of 25, or they're in prison for most of their lives. To think that you're going to succeed in hustling is an illusion. There's a limit to it. So I'm going to get out. And about at the age of 15, which is also a bit precocious, he decided he was going to get out of hustling, and he was going to become the only other thing he could think you could become, which was a rapper. So now he started learning how to rap, and he met Jam Master Jay, and he sort of apprenticed with him, and he started getting reasonably successful, and he had record labels interested in him. And then he realized that this was yet another kind of trap. The trap was that the record label kind of owned you, and they would develop artists very quickly and then get rid of them as soon as they were not so hot anymore. So you usually had like a couple of years of power and success, and then it all faded and you were miserable, and then you went back to drugs or dealing or whatever. That it was almost worse than being a hustler, being a rapper. That to have power in that world was extremely difficult. And he got fed up with it. And he decided to leave it. And he decided he was going to go back into hustling. And he went back into hustling. This is about when he's about 18, maybe 19, I don't remember exactly. And that's when he got shot. I'm sure you all know the story from a beef that was going on, an old beef. Somebody came up to him while he was sitting in the back seat of a car and shot 9 times just a few feet away from him. One of the bullets went right through his mouth. And he miraculously survived that. And it was coming out of that experience that he had his own kind of turning point in life. And he determined after that he was not going to give up. He was not going to get depressed. He was not going to go back into hustling. He was going to launch his music career, but he was going to do it all on his own, all by himself. He was going to launch a kind of mixtape campaign on the streets of New York like no one had ever seen before. Because he didn't have a record label, he was going to be able to be as nasty and violent and tell all kinds of stories, the reality of the streets, because there was nobody there who was going to censor him and say, oh, we can't get that on the radio, we don't want you to say this or that. Fuck all that. I'm going to say exactly what I want, and I'm going to put it out on these mixtapes. I'm going to create a hard sound that's going to be kind of reflect the violence that I've known my whole life. And I'm going to do everything myself. I'm going to package it. I'm going to do my own artwork. I'm going to mix it myself. I'm going to have a group of people around me, but I'm not going to depend on any record label. And he did that with such energy and such drive and such love for it that after 2 years of this campaign, Eminem got one of his mixtapes and thought this was the greatest thing he'd ever heard, and he signed 50 to his record label at Interscope, and then, the rest is history. And so when I was looking at this, the pattern that I saw was that this was somebody that refused to be dependent on other people. He refused to go for the usual traps in life. In this case, hustling on the streets or being a rapper with a good label. He was supremely realistic. He saw through all the bullshit that the world put at you, and he saw, this is where the power lies in life, I'm going to go towards it. And I was thinking, why would somebody like this be so realistic, so pragmatic, and so sharp in his thinking, when a lot of his peers were not like that? A lot of his peers got totally seduced by the idea of becoming a great hustler. And I determined it's because of his very unusual background. 50 never knew his father. To this day, he doesn't know who his father was. His mother was murdered, when he was 8 years old. He lived with his grandparents, but basically he was alone. He had no peers. He had no adult supervision. He was basically thrown out onto the... You need to get that? He was basically thrown out onto the streets of Queens with nobody, nothing. No protection, no parental support. But on the other hand, which we would almost assume is a very negative thing, on the other hand, he had nobody telling him who he should be, what he should do, what defines him. He had to do everything himself. He had to decide who he was, who he wanted to be, without the usual crutches that most of us have. And I determined that in fact, this reality of his, this what I call his existential reality, that he was basically alone in the world and had to do things for himself and define who he wanted to be, that's actually the reality of each and every one of us. But we're not aware of it. We have the illusion that parents, that friends, that all of our support network is going to help us out in the end. That we can define ourselves through other people, by conforming to a group, by being like other people, by doing what other people tell us to do. But that is actually the illusion. That's actually the con game that goes on. The truth is, you are essentially alone in life. You were born alone, and you are going to die alone. And although you have these networks of support, and they are real, and you do have parents, on the other hand, it is really up to you to define who you are and what you want in life. And that what 50 had, and that what most really powerful people have in life, is a sense that they are unique, that there is something very different about them. And to the extent that you bring out your uniqueness in life, that you become more of an individual, that you bring more of your individuality into play, the more power you're going to have. By refusing to be a hustler like everybody else, by refusing to be the typical rapper on a label, by going out there and saying, I don't care about all that, I'm going to create the music that reflects my reality, he stood out from everybody else and he gained power. Now, I talked about this once a few months ago. I was invited to Stanford University to give a little talk, and I was explaining this idea of uniqueness, essentially saying that each and every human being that's ever born, there's never going to be another you ever in the history of the universe. And it's an actually remarkable thought, that your DNA, it will never be repeated, ever in the past, ever in the future. It is completely different. You and your experiences in your life, there will never be anybody else like you. And that you are truly born as an individual, but that you're spending your life running away from it. I gave this talk, and it was a group of people that I don't think were very receptive to this talk. And afterwards, this Italian woman came up to me, and she said, you know, Robert, you're talking about an individual. It is so American. It is so American. This whole thing about the cowboy and Ronald Reagan and being an individual. You know, that's not how we are in Europe. I'm doing a bad job for accents. That's not how we are, you know. For us, that these things aren't important. It's just so American. And then she proceeded to tell me about her grandfather, who was a truck driver in Italy, and how he loved his life as a truck driver, and he was happy as that. And she was saying, what's wrong with that? Why can't people just accept that kind of, if that's what their role in life is? Why do you have to be always striving for something else? And my answer to her, which I will abbreviate, was basically, first of all, how do you know that your grandfather was happy as a truck driver? Usually people, when they're in their 20s or a little bit younger, have a dream about life, an ambition. They want something. And maybe he settled for being a truck driver, and maybe he accepted it. But how do you know deep down inside that that was really what he wanted? You're assuming something. But even let's just pretend that he was happy being a truck driver. You're talking about the 1950s. You're living in a Rossellini neo-realistic movie from the 1950s in which people had a union and there was communism and left-wing activity, and being a truck driver meant something else that it doesn't mean anymore. That truck driver in Italy in the year 2010 is dealing with a globalized environment, the withering away of the welfare state, and is facing all kinds of conflicts and problems, and they're not happy. They're not necessarily happy. That the world that as we're evolving right now is becoming completely different from the world of 50, 60 years ago, where someone like my father would work for one company his whole life and felt protected by them. That's gone. You no longer can depend on anybody and any job or your boss protecting you. We're all dealing with a world that's so much more insecure, where we have to learn these self-reliant skills, where putting out our individuality is the only way we're going to get power in this world. That you're dealing with an environment that is long gone. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. And that the reality that we're all facing is that we're left on our own, and we have to develop these self-reliant skills, and we have to not be afraid of expressing our individuality. In the book that I'm writing now, I can talk about it later if you like, I'm interviewing 8 of the most eminent people in the world today in different fields, in neuroscience, in architecture, in music. All of them are inherently nonconformists. All of them are inherently bucking the trend and taking their field in a completely novel direction by bringing out more of that uniqueness that I was talking about. I realize I've come a little bit longer than I wanted to do on this subject, so I'm not even going to get to my third reality because I want to give you enough time to ask questions. But I wanted to give you an idea of this kind of overall philosophy that is sort of brings all of my books together, and that I'm actually, chapter 1 in the 50th Law, if you've read it, goes very deeply into the subject of realism, and I'm going to be going deeper into it into my next book. But I've kind of hit my own wall here. I've bonked, so I want to open up this now to your questions. So.
You sort of wound up talking about happiness. Would you say that you are happy?
Me personally? Well, it's like it's a weird thing of language to have a word like happiness. When your reality in the day is for 3 minutes you're happy, then for 3 minutes you're anxious, then you get a phone call, and happiness is it never lasts for for 3 days I'm happy, But overall, I'm very lucky and very blessed with my lifestyle in being able to write these books. So if I had to say, am I happier than I was? Yes, I'm much happier than I was before I had a success as a writer. Yeah.
So piggybacking off that question, you're a classicist, so I have to ask, you know how to control men and you know how to control women, God bless you.
Mm-hmm.
But
I don't know about the latter.
The Art of Seduction, so
okay, go on.
But what makes the good life?
The good life?
Is it power?
Yes, because with power comes a degree of freedom. Now, I don't, everybody's an individual. Some people like a position of dependence, and they feel happiest when there's somebody taking care of them. But ultimately, I'm not happy with that because I know that person will eventually withdraw their support. That unless this is someone who I'm going to live with my whole life, that's a different question. That eventually I'm going to be left alone, and that dependency, that love or happiness that came from someone else, I can't really 100% depend on it. So I want to be able to have it depend on something that comes from within. And I want to have it, even to love somebody, even if you're going to live with them, is almost a skill that you have to develop. And it has to come from within. And the only thing that's of value is something that you develop yourself through your life experiences, through maybe some hard times, where you learn how to seduce, you learn how to compromise, you learn how to be in a relationship and how to love. And then once you have that skill, or whatever you want to call it, then nobody can take it away from you, and you have power, and you have freedom, and a degree of happiness. I don't know if I answered your question.
But what would the intrinsic goodness do you be? What's your intrinsic end of the power?
Well, there is no end because we die, and what can I say? I mean, that's the absurd human condition that we have. You can accumulate millions of all the money in the world and all the beautiful women, and then it's gone at some point. So I don't know what your question would be.
Those people that opt out of your system, can they not achieve happiness because they don't have that liberty? The people of the first case that aren't just bad.
Well, I think that it's hard to gauge, and you can't put a number on it. But I think people who are depressed are often depressed because they have no control over their lives. They have no control over their destiny. They feel helpless. They feel like at work They might lose their job any moment now. It's a terrible feeling. They feel that their children aren't listening to them. The man or woman that they want to have a relationship isn't listening to them. That sense of helplessness, to me, is the worst feeling in the world. And obviously there's a quote you've all heard of, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Malcolm X had a comeback to that line that I like a lot more, and he said, absolute powerlessness corrupts even more than that. I'm not quoting it correctly, but the sense the sense of being powerless is much worse, more debilitating on the human spirit than the few people who are corrupted by having power. I still don't know if I've answered your question.
Well, I wonder whether part of your question is, what do you use the power for? Is power the end that you're searching for, or are there things you actually care about trying to, use, to have it make sense to bother to have power for?
Well, it's an interesting.
I'm not sure if that's your question, but that's mine. So.
Yes. No, I didn't. Yeah, that's my fault. I didn't understand. Well, let's say I could talk about myself. The pleasure that comes from me is in writing a book, and in writing the book well, and in spending a lot of time in getting it right, and understanding the real world as it is, the power game, the seduction game, whatever. And then creating a book that goes out in the real world. So half the game of life is doing something that you love and engaging with it deeply. And it's your study, it's your field, it's whatever you produce. But that's only half of it, because if you don't understand the social part, then the book that I write, if I don't know how to deal with people, and I don't understand human nature, and I can't market my book, and my editor hates me, and my agent doesn't know how to work with me, I could love my book, but it won't get out there, it won't get published, it won't have success, and I won't be happy. So it's the fact that the end in life is doing your work that you love and feeling satisfaction. But my experience is a lot of people in this world are talented, and they don't succeed because they don't understand that there's this other side of life, the power game, the Machiavellian game. They fail at it. And they might be a great painter, a great musician, a great business idea, but we're never going to hear of them because they don't understand this. And so to answer your question, the end is the satisfaction that you get with your work, for me. But that can only come with a larger understanding of the social component.
It's interesting because you succeeded in a way at these goals because you were powerless. At least in the vignette that you gave, it was your own experience that you couldn't accomplish what you wanted to.
Right.
That started getting you thinking about how
That's
to
right.
accomplish it. That has now put you where you feel like you can accomplish it, which is right. And, for you, it was somehow that experience of this extreme powerlessness that became the focus of your book and what you cared about getting. And get out of there.
And not to compare myself to 50 because I can't, but it was the same thing with him. When he was shot, he was very depressed, nearly died. He's sitting in bed. He can't talk anymore. He can't sing anymore. He can't go back to the streets hustling because they're going to kill him. The record label dropped him. He had experienced extreme powerlessness, and out of that, he analyzed what it was that he needed to do, and then he reemerged. So maybe there's something to what you're saying.
So you said earlier that it's only when we step out of Yale that we will see this other the other side, and the need for this Machiavellian intelligence as you describe it. But we will be stepping in another type of society, and Yale is a society. Now, why is this different? What led you to say that here's a place where there is no need for that, and we are blinded, kind of? Why did the master say the master sees tomorrow, so he could ask you the question today?
Well, how much, at a place like Yale or any university...
Then you wouldn't show up. You would fail.
Well, I mean, at a university, let's say your goal, more or less, is to graduate with a very high GPA, as high as possible, and land a really great job, perhaps, out of this. To get those high grades, do you need to have Machiavellian skills? Usually not. Usually, professors can be they're not immune to favoritism, to being emotional. So there is a degree of seduction and charm going on. You could charm your professor, perhaps. But more or less, you're being graded on what you've accomplished. Now, that's how life should be, and I wish it were that way. And I wish talent and getting answers right and doing a great essay, I wish that was the whole component. It would be a beautiful world if it could be like that. But it's not how it operates. And so all I'm saying is the element of ego and gamesmanship and politicking, how much does that enter into your goal of success at the university? I don't think it's nearly as much as one experiences in the real world. And in fact, the university, and I could be wrong here, but in fact it tends to breed the opposite idea, which is why I think so many people suffer in life. It breeds the idea that just doing the good job and getting the good grades and succeeding is what will translate into power in the world. And it actually, learning that that's not the case 100% can be quite traumatic. So, I don't know.
Isn't that interesting that a lot of Yale graduates who go out and be in a lot of positions of power, as you might call it, is a very controversial.
How do you mean?
What you just said, that over here kind of there's no need for that, so there's no profit for it. Nevertheless, after graduation, as I said, those people were involved in the described society and just doing well because of the characteristic, the character, they developed education that they got over here.
Well, the education is extremely valuable, and I don't mean to devalue it at all. It's extremely valuable, and the skills that you learn, the analytical skills, the knowledge that you gain will be very valuable. But it's just part of it. And maybe your connections at Yale and the degree, it's has a lot of weight to it, and it can lead to a good job. But then you're on your own, and your personal, interpersonal, political skills were not developed at Yale. Now, there's this university called Cal Arts in California. I have friends who've gone there. A very interesting place. It was a school that was formed in the 60s, essentially. And basically, it's an art school. And they determined that the art world, there is no more political, crabby, competitive, mean-spirited world than the art world. It is, because what makes a great work of art or film is very subjective. And so there's a lot of politicking. And they created this university to literally train their students to be good at that. And so they created this thing where you had to learn how to deal with your professors and deal with the politicking and talk about your work in a way that would charm and seduce, and actually develop the kind of political skills that you're going to need when you later go into the art world. Now, that's kind of a unique thing for a university, and very interesting idea. Yeah.
When you talk about the importance of expressing individuality,
yeah.
Not conforming, but what if following your own ideals means excluding yourself from the crowd and not having a place in the end?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
What if just following your own ideals means excluding yourself from the crowd and not giving yourself a place in the end?
Following your own ideals, means that you have to separate yourself from the crowd.
So which one would you say is more important, being unique or being able to mix with?
Well, they don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. And I didn't get to go into my idea in as much depth as I would like to. I don't mean that, the moment you graduate Yale, you dye your hair green and you start doing something really wild because that's just who you are. That's ridiculous. And it's often not really who you are. It's just because you're trying to rebel and be different. It's more subtle than that. And so, for instance, we all have to serve an apprenticeship in life. So once you graduate Yale, you're going to go work for some high-powered law firm or Wall Street or wherever you go. I don't know. You're not going to have the luxury of suddenly not fitting in and being so weird and different. You're not going to last very long if you do that. You have to be able to take your time and fit into the culture that's created and find your place in it. But the problem is that ends up becoming the end in life. You end up becoming a kind of person that only knows how to fit in, that only knows how to fit into that particular culture. And if you do that long enough, and now you're there and you're 30 years old, and that's the only thing you've ever learned to do, you're afraid to step away from that. You're afraid to express something unique about yourself. And so you have to, when you're in your apprenticeship, in those first years working at that high-powered firm, you have to be constantly waiting for that moment when you're going to do something different. You have to cultivate your own individuality, your own self-reliance skills. People who now, and particularly in business, who are successful, are creating really unique kinds of business. There are new models being created every day. And so if you're having to think about that's the end game in life. I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to create my own business. You can do that from within a large corporation for that apprenticeship phase while you're learning about the world and you're preparing for that moment when you're going to step out on your own. But all I'm saying is, if you end up becoming the kind of person that only knows how to fit into a corporate culture, that's going to be the end of it. That's as far as you're ever going to go. And if that's what you want, that's fine. But power lies in a slightly different direction.
So let me ask one of the written-in questions, and then maybe we'll have time for two more after that. People talk about the importance of charm and charisma. How can these traits be defined? And do you have to be born with them? And I assume implied in the latter question is, what do I have to do to get it?
Well,
how do I learn to be charming and charismatic? Or can I?
Well, the answer to your question is you have to read The Art of Seduction. Because I describe 9 types of seducers in the world. And one of them is the charmer, and one of them is the charismatic. And they're different people. They're different types. And you can, usually charmers are not charismatic, and usually charismatics are not necessarily charmers. They're almost not the same. Charismatics are people who have a tremendous need to get love from the world. They don't want love from one person. They want it from an audience. They often come from backgrounds that are they didn't have happy childhoods. And so to sublimate this need for affection and love, they turn to a large group. And they become charismatic on a global level. They become a Mahatma Gandhi, a John F. Kennedy. All charismatics are burning with a mission, with an idea that makes their whole face light up, their eyes light up, with this idea that they want to convert people to. And this sense of being alive with this inner fire is what people feel is charisma. Seduction is a nonverbal language, which is why I know The Art of Seduction is written with words, but it's a language that's nonverbal. You can't tell people you're charismatic. You can't communicate it outwardly. They have to feel it in an animal way. So in the book, I say, some people are born with charisma because they come from bad backgrounds, like Marilyn Monroe, who was an orphan. You're not necessarily from that background, but you can learn the idea of your inner conviction is what people feel. They see it in your hands, in your eyes. Like 50 has charisma, and I've watched him. Everybody feels it around him. You have to have that inner conviction. Your whole body has to be alive with it, or you're not going to have charisma. You can learn to a degree, but there's a limit unless you're not born that way. Charm is a whole more possible realm for everyone. And charm is knowing how to please other people. There's a famous quote about a woman who said, sitting next to, this is about Gladstone and Disraeli, two British politicians of the 19th century who were rivals. And she said, sitting next to Gladstone, I thought he was the most brilliant man in the world. Sitting next to Disraeli, I thought I was the most brilliant woman in the world. That's the charmer. The charmer is somebody who knows how to make the other person feel great about themselves. And it's a really important social skill. It means not thinking about yourself, but imagining what the other person wants to hear, what their weakness is, what they need validation. You have to be outer directed. And it's very important and very powerful, and anybody can learn it, and I talk about it in the book. So seducers are not born, they're made. And you may not end up becoming Cleopatra, but you can go halfway or a quarter of the way. Did you want to ask another anonymous question?
No, let's go over here to get two more from the crowd.
So,
and then
you mentioned entrepreneurs, and
Yeah.
I also heard from a lot of entrepreneurs that they say that in order to be wildly successful, you have to be prepared to wildly fail.
Yeah.
And does that fit into sort of your paradigm of
Very much.
power, and how so?
Very much so. I'll be looking a lot about that in my next book. All of the most creative people are experimenters who have many failures. Einstein, who I've been reading a lot about, he said, I measured my success by how full my wastebasket was. How many ideas I threw away meant that I was on the right track. If my wastebasket was empty, I wasn't being creative. You're going to be measured by your failures, and the reason is we learn by doing. You can't learn how to run a business. You can't learn how to have success by reading a book. I'm afraid I'm just dissuading all of you from buying my books. But ultimately, a book has a limit. It's your own experience in doing things where you learn, this is what connected with my audience. This is what got that guy interested in my idea. And so you have to go out there and be not afraid of trying things, starting a business. They've shown entrepreneurs that I don't know the number, but it was like 95% of them, their first ventures fail. And the ones who are successful go on to a second and a third one and a fourth one. They're called serial entrepreneurs. So you have to not be afraid of failure. You have to be the kind of person that tries things out and learn from your experiences. And if you're afraid of that, it's going to be very difficult to gain the kind of real world knowledge that you need in order to have success. So it's very important.
So you talk a lot about personal characteristics like charisma, aggressiveness, etc. But 50 Cent wouldn't have been able to sell a mixtape if the environment wasn't ready for it.
Yeah.
And there's that French minister who survived from the French Revolution all the way through, Napoleon, an actor,
Talleyrand.
who just
Fouché.
Fouché, who noted just the ebbs and flows and trends. What do you think about aside from personal charisma and characteristics at all, about the natural way that opportunities and political opinions sway with the time?
Well, it's a good question because, a lot of people will say, well, they look at a Clinton or Barack Obama and they'll say what makes them so brilliant or how did they succeed in an election. And a lot of it, a good degree, is luck. You come on the world stage at the right time. So there is always a degree of luck in anybody's success. I met this man in Italy. If I didn't have met him in 1995, I still might be slaving away in some cubicle in Hollywood, and you would never have heard of me. I had the luck to meet this man. But the difference is, everybody has luck. Something happens to you. It's just, what do you do with it? Are you the kind of person that recognizes the opportunity? When Barack Obama was first deciding to run for presidency, it happened to be a lucky moment where this was probably the only moment where he could have won an election, given his background. But he was the one that recognized this was the moment, and I'm going to seize it. When everybody was telling him, you're not ready to run, you need to wait 4 more years. And he said, no, I see this as the opportunity. So what separates people in life are, a good thing will happen to you and you let it pass. You know, if you're an opportunist, which I talk about in the 50th law, you recognize that opportunity has come and you work like a fiend in order to make it happen. So when this man gave me the opportunity to write the 48 Laws of Power, I worked night and day, my birthday, Christmas, 365 days a year, till 1 o'clock in the morning. I was not going to let go of my one opportunity in life. And that's, to me, what separates people who take an opportunity like that and others who let it slip by. Did that answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
So let me make a comment and get your reactions, and then I think we'll sort of finish up. I know when I first started looking at some of what you wrote and hearing you today, it would be easy to take much of what you say as instructions for how to use other people, how to get them to do your bidding. And there's clearly a way in which much of the laws are written that way. And that's a very, sort of instrumental view of other people. How do I turn them into means, for you to accomplish something? Also, though, mixed in as you talked and as we talked earlier, I had a sense that some of what you're really interested in is something that, say, some of the psychologists here and our provost here to study, which is emotional intelligence. How do I understand how other people think and what moves them and what their emotional state is and how my actions will interact with theirs, and that having some honed emotional intelligence might put me in a position to be able to accomplish things that I want, but also be attuned to what they want, and not necessarily treat them as means, but treat them as as their own independent entities. And so I was wondering how you think about those tensions.
Yeah, but it becomes tricky because if you're thinking about them deeply in their own needs, where's the distinction for them becoming a sort of a means to it? What are you trying to accomplish? If you're trying to, for instance, forge a political organization where people are all on the same page with a sense of mission, and you need to be sensitive to the kinds of people that will join your group, and you're aware of their own needs and the fact that they're an individual. But you're, on the other hand, you're bringing them into the group and you have a mission, you're trying to accomplish it. What separates them from being a means or an instrument, and also being attuned to their individuality and what their separateness is? Why does it have to be mutually exclusive?
I don't know what they are. I don't know that they are. But I do think that the focus on sort of what's that other person's interest and what would really matter to that person, and how might we both be able to accomplish what we both care about, we get our goals in alignment. Go back to where you ran into the difficulty that you talked about.
Right.
The boss who, squashing you. Was there another way than just to say, well, never outshine my boss, but to think, no, I shouldn't outshine her. How do I bring her over?
Yes.
But then it aligns with, we both want to create these stories.
Well, yes, and in the book, in the 48 Laws of Power, I talk about how you do not outshine people and get them, but then it gets very Machiavellian. It's a good point because people mistake my books for being purely about how to use people, and it's all kind of selfish. But particularly in the Art of Seduction, I make the point that you're not going to get far unless you are a kind of person that knows how to think inside the other person's mind. And that requires a totally different kind of personality, where you have to kind of not be so self-absorbed, where you can think inside of other people and what their interests are and what's going to appeal to them. That's the secret to being successful as a politician or a business person or in any kind of relationship. And I go as deeply into that as I can, but not many people recognize that because they only see the element of using other people for what you want. So.
Yeah, well, that's what I was aware of.
Right.
So you do have that component, but it may not be the most visible. So,
yeah.
But I wanted to thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much for
that.